So I finally like to call this lecture "Don't Wait for Post," because I often hear students say, I can just fix it in the computer later. But it's always better to get it right the first time, get it right in camera. So here are a couple visuals, for example, or for starters, that illustrate how a camera meter works. A camera meter, I should just say, starts by taking all of the pixels in a scene and averaging them to a 50% gray. But essentially 50, I think it's actually maybe 18% gray, kind of think of it. It averages it to a gray, okay? Mathematically, someone figured out that everything in the world, when sunlight is shining on it, is this certain brightness. So it takes everything together, kind of mushes it, and figures out what a good exposure should be. So in a backlight portrait situation, the image on the left of this man is what the camera would think is the right brightness, because there's a lot of dark and shadow areas on the man, and the sky behind them is really bright. So we can't always rely on our meter, is the point. And we might want to instead overexpose from what is suggested, or what the meter thinks is right, in order to get our subject to look best. In this case, being able to see his face is what's going to look best. So there's a few other sort of scenes that relate to this. For example, a snowy scene. A snowy scene is often going to be rated by a camera to make the snow look like a, let's call it middle to light gray. But instead, you really want the snow to be an almost bright white, but still have some detail. On the other hand, if there's a scene that is really dark, like this sculpture on the bottom right, it may actually overexpose the sculpture to be a brighter gray than it should be, or when it should be close to black. So use your best judgment. We can fix things in post to some extent, but it's always better to expose for what you really kind of know. Like you can, on the back of your camera, see, oh, well, that came out a little dark or a little light compared to what I'm seeing. You can also do things in a camera to manipulate that, to make them brighter or darker. For now, what I would say is there are two things to familiarize yourself with in the camera. If you have it, it may be exposure variation, which will allow you to, exposure compensation. Well, I suppose it's on some cameras called exposure variation, which will allow you to overexpose by 1 or 2 stops. And these are kind of what the meter readings look like on a Canon and a Nikon on the left. But there's also this nice feature on some cameras called auto exposure bracketing. So you can set the camera to what the camera thinks is a good picture, and you can actually set it to take 3 pictures in a row, or even on some cameras, I think mine allows 5 or 7 different pictures. And they're equally spaced apart. Usually I would set it as a default of 1 stop separated, but on some cameras you can do them 1/3 of a stop, 2/3 of a stop, a full stop, so on and so forth, a couple of stops apart. And that way you end up with 1 well exposed, 1 overexposed, and 1 underexposed picture every time. And then you can just pick which one is the best when you get into the computer. So another thought about over and underexposure is that the display on the back of your camera doesn't always give you an accurate picture. What you see there might not be what you actually see when you get into the computer. So it's a good reason for this bracketing thing. And you can do this manually, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. So when you get into manual mode, I think I've talked about this before, you can control both the aperture and the shutter speed, and you can almost always control the ISO no matter what mode you're in. And so that allows you to bracket. Okay, I got to a little quicker than I thought I was going to, but so bracketing is the idea of taking multiple pictures of different exposures to ensure that you have one with all the details and the highlights and all the details and the shadows, and spreading them apart across a couple stops usually ensures that you get that. Not as important in digital photography, but in film photography, we used to use the sunny 16 rule. So if it was a sunny day, you could set your aperture to 16 and then just match your shutter speed to your ISO, and you would almost always get a perfect exposure. And you just go one stop more light for partly sunny and another stop beyond that for a fully overcast cloudy day. It's not as important these days because you can see the back of your camera and know what you're working with. All right, back to histograms. So I have 3 different histograms here. And usually I would ask the class, well, what do you think you're seeing here? And we start off by saying, oh, I don't really know. Well, a histogram is a graph of all the values in the picture from pure black on the left to pure white on the right. And if you remember when I talked about histograms before, I talked about spiking or cliffs on the sides of the histogram graph. So this first histogram, I'm gonna talk about the first one and the third one first, and then we'll go back to the middle one. The first one represents an image that has really, really high contrast. So there is no detail in some areas of pure black on the left and some areas of pure white on the right. So this is something that we normally wouldn't see except for when we're using artificial lighting in the studio, or I suppose photographing at night. So really, really high contrast, and if you can, you need to find a way to reduce the contrast. Most of the time, photographing the day, you're not going to have this problem at all. You might have one spec up, but not both. All right, now, skipping down to the third one, this image represents an image that has no values that are specking up, but also no values that are close to pure black or pure white. They're not even like, say, 20%, within a range of 20% of pure black or pure white. So it's a really incredibly flat image. This is maybe a little bit more common on a really, really overcast day, or perhaps just after sunset when there is very low contrast. And the idea here is that you don't want to end up having to do a lot of post-production work. So if you can, you want to avoid these situations. What ends up happening if you edit this photo on the bottom is that you end up with the photo in the middle, and that is called combing. And so what it's basically done is it's spread out the values in the photograph, so you have a near black and then you have a near white, but you end up pulling apart values. And so instead of having smooth gradations, you end up with what they call posterization, where you have kind of like, instead of having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 values, you end up with 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 values, if that makes sense. And so you have, instead of a smooth transition between colors or brightness values, you have gaps, you have skips, and those can be seen in prints more easily than on a computer screen. So avoid doing that if possible. All right, unrelated to that, but sort of related to post, is that your camera captures a lot of information when you take a picture. And this is stuff that can be pulled up in post in the software. And it'll tell you things like the date and time you made the photo. Again, if you have the date and time set properly. Your shutter aperture, your focal length, your ISO, what program meter, or if you had your camera on, whether it's shutter aperture, manual exposure, that sort. And then the kind of information about what your camera and your lens is. So what's valuable about this is that you can go back and look at this information. If you have a photo that came out blurry, for example, and you want to know why, well, if it tells you that you were working with a 1/8 of a second and you were hand holding and your photo's blurry, well, that makes sense. So we can look these things up and try and troubleshoot them. Okay, I wanted to kind of go back to the idea of bracketing for a second. And this is sort of a visual representation of that. And usually with bracketing, I would do the middle picture being what the camera thinks is a good exposure. And then we've got an underexposed and an left picture being what the camera thinks is a good picture, the middle being underexposed, and the right being overexposed. I would say that the left one is probably the best of them, but the idea is that you'd end up with 3 with a range, and you have more to manipulate if you aren't sure about having a perfect exposure. You can pick the best one in post. Okay, and then this is sort of out of order, but this is a visual of what that posterizing might look like when we have to do major manipulation to get the right contrast in a photo. Instead of having what should be a smooth gradation on this top line, you end up with these sort of skips in the gradations. So I hope that visual makes some sense. And that wraps up this slideshow.